Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Don's Drum Vault. Today I'm sitting here with a really special collection of drums. Way before I ever thought I was a drum collector or a drum dealer, I just played drums and I thought drums were cool. And one of the coolest sets that I'd ever seen in my life was Ringo Starr's Beatles Black Oyster Ludwig set. And years ago, 40 years ago, I thought it'd be cool to find one of those, which, back then would have just been an old used Ludwig drum set in the Black Oyster finish. And, I'd kind of watch the want ads and keep an eye open in music stores. It was always on the hunt for one of these. And, sometimes I'd go out, I'd answer an ad, and I'd get there and what the person called Black Oyster actually turned out to be some other color. But I might end up buying the set anyway and thinking, well, I could buy this, maybe I could sell it, make a few bucks, and then that would give me a little more money to find the one that I want. So hunting for a Black Oyster Ringo set is really what got me into the business of dealing in vintage drums, and that was sort of like the first step in, a journey, I guess you'd call it, that's got me to where I am right now. So through the course of my life, I've come across, dozens of them. And there've been many times where I'd buy one and I say, yay, I finally have the drum set. I'll never get rid of it. But then, somebody wants it, or maybe I find a little nicer one, so then that one gets sold, I'll get the other one. Anyway, that has gone on through the course of my life, and like I said, I don't know, there've been dozens of these sets that I've had, but I'm sitting behind the drum set that in over 40 years of hunting for a Ringo kit like this is hands down the best one I've ever seen, between the condition and the accuracy or the exactness in similarity to the set that Ringo used. I have not ever come across a better one. Let's talk a little bit about the whole story of Ringo's drums, and then we'll get into the particulars of this set and the other two that I've got here today. So, back in 1963, as the Beatles were really starting to take off, their wave was just starting to crest. They were being managed by Brian Epstein, which really helped take them up to the next level. They weren't quite a worldwide phenomenon yet, but it was almost there. Ringo and Brian went into a place called Ivor Arbiter's Drum City, a little drum shop in London, and with the mission of getting Ringo a new drum set. And there, Ringo saw a set just like this one in the window. He loved the finish, and he loved the fact that they were Ludwig, because that was an American brand, and to have an American brand in England was a really cool thing. And he went home that day with a set identical to this drum set. So this is a Ludwig, would have been called a downbeat configuration, more or less, with a 12 by 8 inch tom-tom, 14 by 14 inch floor tom, and a 20 by 14 inch bass drum in what they would have called Ludwig Oyster Black finish. The snare drum that should have come with this set was a thinner 4 by 14 inch snare. I don't know exactly what happened, but the snare that Ringo went home with was a Jazz Festival model, which is deeper. It's a 5 by 14 inches. And as it turns out, in the particular period that Ringo bought those in 1963, that drum, which would have generally been a 5-inch deep shell, for some reason was a 5.5 inch deep shell. And that the drum was only made like that for a very short time, but it did make that snare drum very unique. And even though throughout the Beatles' career, Ringo had a total of 5 drum sets from that period on, 4 of which were in the Black Oyster finish, he used the same snare drum that he bought with that first set throughout. So he basically used one snare drum for the entire Beatles' career with almost no exceptions. So in retrospect, that model snare drum has become sort of the holy grail Beatles snare drum to find. And they were only made for a short period in around 1963. And what makes it even more interesting and ultimately rarer was by the time the Beatles ended up on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964, Ludwig had changed the configuration of that drum. So it went back to a 5-inch deep shell, and they changed the configuration of the hardware, the way it was set up on the drum. So on Ringo's drum, you'll notice that the muffler, badge, and throw-off are all right next to each other. They're consecutive. By 1964, that pattern had changed. So when the Beatles went on Ed Sullivan, and everyone in the United States really got pretty much their first chance to ever see the Beatles, it's legendary now about how orders for Ludwig drums went up 600% overnight, which is phenomenal. So demand for Ludwig drum sets, particularly in this finish, went sky high, and they made literally thousands of these sets. But by the time that had happened, they'd already changed the configuration. So if you ordered a drum set in 1964, you would have got one in a slightly different configuration to Ringo's, which at the time really didn't make any difference at all, you know, the placement of your muffler, your throw-off. But then, you know, we flash forward to 2020, and when now it's like the most collected drum set ever, and a snare like this is in extreme high demand. So since these drums in this configuration, which is now called the Ringo Spec configuration, since these were made for such a short period and they're in such high demand, one of these drums has become an extremely valuable drum. I mean, the value of these would be considered somewhere between $20,000 and $25,000 for one of these drums in good condition. Now, where it gets very interesting is on the depths. So I mentioned before that Ringo's snare was 5.5 inches deep. Well, the snares, even within that year period they make them, those shells varied within about 1/4 of an inch. So you'd see the drums anywhere from about 5.25 to 5.5 inches. Anyway, a beautiful drum and a beautiful set. Ringo's first Black Oyster set, first of the 4 that he used in his tenure with the Beatles. The first, like I said, is the downbeat configuration, 20, 12, 14 bass and toms. The first set was that, as was the second set he got, same configuration, again still using the same snare, the original snare. Then in 64 he got what would have been considered the super classic sizes, which is like one step up. So bass drum with a 22-inch bass drum, 13-inch mounted tom, and a 16-inch floor tom. And then he used those through late 60s till about 1967, 68. And at that point, he got the Maple set that a lot of people call the Rooftop set or the Let It Be set. That being also a Ludwig. And again, still, even up to that set, he was still using his, what is now known as the Ringo Spec snare. So, as you can see, I've got 3 of these sets here, and you know, Ringo kind of roughly went through 3 phases of his drum sound with the Beatles. And so that evolved as the Beatles' music evolved and what they needed evolved. So let's take a look at a little bit of that. So Ringo's first Beatles set that he was using starting about 1963 were these smaller Ludwig drums that he had tuned pretty open and lively. And they're smaller drums, so they were comfortable in higher tunings. And that's what you would hear on the first couple records. So here's an idea about what that sounded like. So as the Beatles started playing in larger venues and competing with much greater crowd noise, the legendary screaming that you would find at a Beatles concert, they needed to be able to hear themselves on stage. The amps got bigger and Ringo's drum set also became bigger. Ringo's initial set he'd chosen because it was very small. Ringo's a pretty short guy, and he felt that it made him look taller, having the small drums. He sacrificed his vanity for a larger and louder set. And this is what that would sound like. That carried him through the mid-60s to the later part of the 60s. And at that point, the drum sounds in the studio started to get very different. A technique of muffling the drums a lot, even like covering them with towels and getting a really thuddy kind of a sound came into vogue. And the Beatles and Ringo really kind of led that. So at that point, he would have had the front bass drum head removed with a pillow in the bass drum, and then towels, which were actually English tea towels, laid over the drum, and that would completely muffle the resonance, just giving a really big thud, which actually, while it was quieter in volume, it translated to recording to where they could get the impact and the presence of the drums much higher in the mix. So here's what that would sound like. So it really is kind of exciting for me to be sitting here with these three sets. I mean, these are the three best Ringo kits that I've encountered in over 40 years of searching for this stuff. And I honestly think what'll probably happen is I will let a couple of these go, and I'll probably end up keeping one. I'll sell two, and whichever one remains, that'll be the one that I keep. Famous last words. I know I've said that before, but we'll see. So it really is great that you've come along on this trip with me, and I hope you enjoyed it, and we're going to see you on the next episode of Don's Drum Vault.